Welcome to our newest installment of Maps in History. Today we're going to talk about the Cold War, and we have a couple of Cold War maps. And these maps are really designed to give us a broader setting and understanding for many of the issues we're discussing in class with regard to Cold War foreign policy and domestic politics as well. So let's start with our first map. Our first map here is of really what the Cold War looks like in the early 1950s. This is at the height of McCarthyism. This is after the Chinese Communist Revolution. You can see that China here on the map has turned red. The red countries are the areas that have gone communist and are under what is perceived by the United States and largely, truthfully, is Soviet influence. What you'll notice on this map are a couple of things. First of all, the United States, the blue area, is not only in the Western Hemisphere, but in large parts of Europe and Asia, and has allies in the South Pacific as well. You'll notice that you have two worlds here, therefore, a communist and a non-communist world, but the non-communist world is much larger. Second, you will notice, especially in Africa, there is a large colonial area. That's what the green is here, Western colonies. Those are areas that are still under British or French or Portuguese control, which means they are at least indirectly allied with the United States. These areas of empire are still hanging on into the early 1950s, and these are areas of limited national independence within those countries. The third point you might want to see on this map, which I think is important for us here, is that the Soviet and communist-led areas are landlocked for the most part and are in one landmass, and the United States and its allies are much more global, much more spread out. This is an advantage for the United States, but it's also a disadvantage. We're spread thin. We have to send resources very, very far away. One of the things that worries the McCarthyites, we talked about this in class, is that this solid Soviet communist landmass appears to be getting stronger, not weaker as such. Okay, let's flash forward now. This Cold War map covers the period about a decade and a half later. This takes us into the 1960s and 1970s, and we see a different world here. There are some similarities again. The core of the United States is the Western Hemisphere, the core of its alliance, and the core of the Soviet alliance is, of course, the Soviet Union. You have these two large communist and non-communist political actors that dominate the international landscape. But you have a much more complex world, as we discussed in lecture, through the 1960s and 70s. First of all, you have in Africa the end of empire, with a few exceptions. So many of these countries that in the prior map, I'll go back to that quickly, had been green, everyone see the green there, have now become red, blue, or neutral, gray, which is to say they've become either new states that are allied with the Soviet Union, or new states that are allied with the United States, or new states that are not allied with either side. And this makes for a much more complicated world. As we've discussed in lecture, both the United States and the Soviet Union are competing to get new allies in these former colonial areas. And many of these former colonial states are making difficult choices between one side or the other, or neither of the two sides. China, you will notice, is not colored red here. This is important. China is still a communist government, but by the 1960s, the Chinese and the Soviets have very severe differences, and as we've discussed in lecture, by the late 1960s, the Soviet Union and China will see themselves as rivals. They will be rivals for leadership of the communist world, and so the Soviet alliance is breaking apart there. What we see in this map, therefore, is the growth of Soviet power, the growth of red into former colonial areas, which worries the United States, but at the same time, the fracturing of the alliance between communist China and the Soviet Union. The United States is beginning to spread into more areas, and many of the areas the United States is in now involve more militarized activity, particularly Vietnam, Indochina, which is right there. This is a much more complex world. The Cold War by the late 1960s, early 1970s is about more than just Soviet-American rivalry. It's much more global. It has more actors, more complexity, and quite frankly, more difficulty for the United States. And those difficulties, those challenges, will be at the center of our discussions of the second half of the Cold War. Thank you for joining us for Maps in History.